thank you, Eckart, so much for that warm welcome, for the invitation to come today. It's really been fantastic to interact with so many of you in the chat as we've come forward. Can you see me okay? Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
All right, wonderful. Actually, no, sorry, I'm gonna have to try this again. All right, so anyway, I think we can proceed from here. Can everybody see okay? Yeah? So anyway, big thanks, as I was saying, to Eckart, to Maria, to all of the speakers. I've seen really a lot of incredible speakers, and everyone in the chat, everyone in the virtual audience. These sessions have really been a joy. They've been a highlight of the past few months for me. I also want to express equally big apologies to Tom Leach, who is here tonight, who promised all of you a less hectic presentation from me this week. Unfortunately, all I have to offer you is chaos. I hope that my broader questions at least might prompt further discussion in the chat and after the talk. You know, I am not as skilled as Tom at juggling between the chat and my talk, so I look forward to catching up with all of that once it's done. As Eckart mentioned, my title is Adaptation and National Cinema. While talking about exactly this was my initial intent, I have managed to exceed this topic in ways that shall soon become clear. Still, I don't think that I've strayed quite far enough to warrant a title change. So instead, my plan is to outline the strands of my thinking that have brought me to this point. So the context here is really one of weaving together multiple threads. Of course, we have a dose of adaptation, that's not a surprise, but also I want to fold in a little bit of nostalgia studies, which is an area that I've sort of just started to explore. Here I want to give a quick shout out to the International Media Nostalgia Network, which is available online. Lots of scholars, it's highly interdisciplinary. You've got people in psychology, sociology, true social scientists, and also humanists of all stripes working in nostalgia. And it was really for the Nostalgia and Contemporary European Culture Work Group, which also had a conference in 2018. Tom's keynote was published in the proceedings, that have gotten me thinking about these overlaps between nostalgia and adaptation. Noticing that there is at least a presence, if not a predominance, of adaptation in textual studies of nostalgia. And this led to the special issue of Adaptation, the journal on adaptation and nostalgia, which I edited and came out about a year ago in December of 2020. So the other thing that is almost impossible not to notice is the inflection of national levels and nationalism within nostalgia. And this absolutely comes through in several of the published contributions to the special issue. And this is something that nostalgia theorist Svetlana Boym expounds upon in her book, The Future of Nostalgia, which was published in 2001. And we've seen this correlation between nationalism and nostalgia only strengthened by the rise of the global right. So this leads us then to national cinemas, which is the third strand. And as Eckart mentioned, my background is actually in French studies. So I come to adaptation not from, I think, what is a more typical trajectory, which is through English, but from France, where I first studied French cinema as a national cinema, and my focus was initially on the 1930s. So really a time of nationalisms run rampant kind of in lots of places. You see a lot of parallels with what's going on now. So anyways, I dealt with French cinema of the 1930s in my dissertation, which became my first book. After which, as I mentioned, I moved to Turkey, which was my introduction to Turkish national cinema. And that has its own very particular relationship to intertextuality. And that's something that I'll be talking about in this presentation. What I'm going to talk about in a little bit is a case study of the Turkish director Zeki Demirkubuz. And this study is based on a chapter that is forthcoming that I've co-authored with my former student from Bilkent, Marcsek-Fuchs, who is currently at the University of Toronto, and he will be presenting his own take on our work at the upcoming LFA-AAS joint conference in a couple weeks, 10 days, I think, not even a couple weeks. But the title of our chapter is Adaptation in the New Turkish Cinema. And the forthcoming volume where this will appear is the Routledge Companion to Global Literary Adaptation in the 21st Century, which has been edited by Liz Ho and Brandon Chua. so what I want to do with this presentation is really, on the one hand, look at whether we really want to abandon borders. As Eckart suggests, we might want to debate the idea of whether avoiding boundaries or borders is really, it's a good thing, or I would argue, is it even doable? Which is sort of where we come to here. We've seen several presentations in this series that will interrogate how adaptation can challenge or blur constructions of cultural identity. And this kind of challenge is generally done very openly when the adapters do not sit at the upper echelons of global power. We could see this in Shudha Shilshen's presentation, Julie Sanders' talks, both of them about Shakespeare and how Shakespeare has sort of spread beyond its national roots to become a kind of global heritage. Now, of course, I want to express my fervent support for this kind of adaptation and for any scholarship that seeks to examine it. Generally, though, the focus of these studies tends to fall on people like Shakespeare, these inarguably canonical texts, inarguably canonical authors, and discusses their ability to transcend these kinds of boundaries. This ends up reinscribing or reinforcing their canonized status. And this is also going to feed into the case study that we'll talk about with Demirkubuz. It would be interesting, though, of course, beyond the scope of this particular talk, to look at how non-canonical texts can be reformulated across social groups in ways that might similarly challenge those formations, but that's not the kind of work that we tend to see in this area. The uses of adaptation for more conservative ends, that is, to establish or maintain particular social boundaries, particularly national ones, rather than transcend, confound, resist, or reject them, these are not always examined specifically as conservative tools. But even if our aim ultimately is to eschew reactionary conservatism, as mine certainly would be, boundaries remain crucial to how adaptation operates within the culture industries, as Simone Murray has laid out. Again, other presentations in this series, which again, the title of which is Adaptation Without Borders, have indeed relied on national frameworks for discussing adaptation. Hibon Park Finch with her feminist Korean novel turned far less feminist film. We've got next week's talk from Peter Bubenecek about Czech post-war surrealism. Apologies if I've butchered names here. There are a few other candidates for this list. Those were unfortunately weeks that I missed, so I can't really speak to them. But not all meaningful social boundaries are ultimately national. Language is, of course, one of them, and it's a big one because of the predominance of Anglophone studies within adaptation studies. But the transnational, and this is really visible in the transnational framework that Simone Murray proposes in the adaptation industry. It's exclusively Anglophone, even if, Anglophonie, as we would put in French studies, that covers multiple countries at the same time. Regional identities are also extremely important, both within and beyond the nation state. Adaptation can be used to map specific transnational affiliations, which is something that we see very clearly in the Turkish case study. In current scholarship, the uses of adaptation for conceptions of national, regional, or other geographically and culturally circumscribed identities tends to fall under categories that are focused on genre and medium. And this would include the heritage film, historical dramas, biopics. This reminds me the Oscar nominations are out today. All of these genres are already represented in the 5 minutes I had to scroll through Twitter and find these nominations. And we also have television adaptations, and especially in the UK. And this is where a lot of scholarship has brought in discussions of industry. And this too is something that we will see in the Turkish example, though my goal is to talk a little less about television and kind of try to keep the focus on cinema if I can. These genre categories foreground the literary canon as well as lived history. And with regard to historical adaptation, the connection to adaptation is often left implicit, if not disregarded more or less entirely in those kinds of studies. But there are adaptations that do not fall under these categories, such as transnational remakes or the contemporary products and byproducts of the adaptation industry. And these can also depend precisely on cultural boundaries to make meaning. So regarding these cultural boundaries, the question is one of identifying collectives, which, Eckart, I'm borrowing your term here from a chapter you wrote and published in 2012. And this term collectives is a potentially more palatable alternative to national or even transnational frameworks. And this adjustment is appealing for several reasons. First of all, it's flexibility, because the collective can readily exceed the category of the nation state, as it does in transnationalism, or it can designate selected factions within it. And these groups may form non-state alignments of their own, as we see with other terms like fourth cinema or third cinema, which also touch on international trends in filmmaking over film history. The term collective also has the potential to elide state-based politics. Collective could just as easily refer to entirely non-state entities like fandoms or social clubs or alumni organizations or Twitter users or the attendees of this lecture series or labor unions or any other group with shared interests and a sense of investment in sustaining that collectivity. And here we can look at two examples, perhaps. Boots Riley's 2015 film, Sorry to Bother You, as a narrative reflection of labor as a collective consciousness. Also a brilliant movie. If you've not seen Sorry to Bother You, you're in for a treat. And the 2020 film Zola began as a Twitter thread. I have not yet seen it, but the fact that it began as a Twitter thread, I'm teaching Hustlers, which began as a kind of a journalistic publication, a long form magazine article. And that's another sort of it's another source that we can draw on to sort of make these collectives. Voluntary collectives like these highlight the arbitrariness of national frameworks, where membership depends far more often on the circumstances of one's citizenship or statelessness. And these are overwhelmingly, though still not exclusively, produced by factors that lie beyond individual control. Now, the galaxy-brained endgame of this line of thinking, and we'll return to this at the end of the talk, this is where we connect adaptation to community, very broadly speaking. And we'll return to this, as I said, at the end. But here, I want to return to my stated focus on national and transnational screen adaptations and consider how adaptation can reinforce or redraw boundaries that delineate a culturally distinct collective according to these very familiar, if ever shifting, imaginaries. So framed as broadly as possible, and this is where we get into the sort of career retrospectiveness of this talk, my scholarly interest here lies in the appropriation or adaptation of nationally resonant cultural material, wherever we may find it, by creators who come from outside of that culture. This is often, but not only, accomplished through overt adaptation, but appropriation can also play a role, and we'll see that in the French and non-French examples towards the end. The result of this transnational appropriation can offer a sense of borrowed nostalgia that moves across geographic space as well as time. The process of cross-cultural borrowing can propose specific alignments or realignments of cultural collectives that might otherwise be considered distinct. And as far as the big picture goes, to consider how adaptation can be leveraged in defining social groups. This process that involves setting limits that create in-groups and by extension out-groups. I believe the social process to be as inevitable as it is contingent, but I do proceed with the conviction that this process of social grouping can and should be less arbitrary in its inclusions and exclusions. A second idea, which is more a thesis than a conviction at this stage of research, is that adaptation in particular can model positive inclusion for social groups, whether by redefining existing categories, like, for example, the nation itself, or by eschewing these categories to create new and less arbitrarily defined collectives. So for this presentation, as you can see on the slide, I have two cases to discuss, of course, depending on time. The first will look at patterns of literary adaptation in contemporary Turkish film, presenting a rather traditional national and transnational binary. And initially, this is all I had planned to present when I agreed to the talk, and I've sort of ballooned it out from there. But this is the core of it, and this is the co-authored chapter that we'll start with. But the second case, time permitting, we will look at the 2011 films Hugo and The Artist. Speaking of the Oscars again, I think I'm the only person who remembers The Artist, even though it basically swept the Oscars that year. Anyway, we'll look at these two films to consider how cinema might surpass national frameworks through appropriation of its own history, looking at how both films leverage nostalgia across national lines to define a cinephile collective, not according to nation, but with respect to cinema itself. And so we start here with the new Turkish cinema. So the subtitle here would be National Screens, Transnational Adaptations, the new Turkish cinema. Now, I just want to reiterate, this is all co-authored with Mert Ursulaer. He's going to be doing his own version of this in a couple of weeks. But anyways, just to start with a really huge statement, the history of screen media in Turkey is absolutely rife with intertextuality. I do not have time to get into the details of that history here. There is a brief version of that history in the chapter that is forthcoming, but this intertextuality is perhaps most famously exemplified in the cheaply made remakes and rip-offs of Hollywood films that proliferated in Turkey during the mid-20th century. Some of these films have also become objects of cultish interest outside of Turkey under titles like Turkish Star Trek and Turkish Star Wars, which are obviously not their native titles. But even these are only the tip of a much larger iceberg of cross-cultural appropriation. The late Lawrence Ross spent a lot of time looking at these adaptations and these intertextual examples as well. So he's one to look up if that's a point of interest for you. Literary adaptation, specifically, also has a long history in Turkey, and that's something that Mert gets into in the chapter. Recent adaptations of literary fiction for film and television in Turkey have been deployed to diverging political ends. And for my purposes here today, it's these national and transnational alignments that I aim to discuss. I want to focus particularly on the New Turkish Cinema, which is abbreviated NTC in certain places. And as a term, this refers to a wave of once young and now not so young filmmakers who emerged in the late 1990s and remain active today. And these would include Nuri Bilge Ceylan, Yeşim Ustaoğlu, and Zeki Demirkubuz, who's in the photo, if you can see him. Zeki Demirkubuz is in the middle, and his acting partner is on our right-hand side. That is Engin Günaydın, who appears in Yeraltı, which is not the film I'll be talking about, but that's not the prime example, but it's another one that absolutely applies to what I'm talking about here. So the New Turkish Cinema is these figures of the New Turkish Cinema are primarily known as directors, but they also assume other production roles before and behind the camera. And this would include writing or quite often adapting the films that they direct. So in this sense, the New Turkish Cinema has taken a very auteurist approach to filmmaking in the contemporary sense of auteurism, where it's lots of different kinds of work and different skills being put in the service of a particular project. Now, the source texts that New Turkish cinema filmmakers have adapted have come almost exclusively from Western canonical literature, particularly French authors and Russian authors. This prevalence of French and Russian source text, as Mert's research has revealed, reflects to a high degree the national high school curriculum in Turkey, which combines Turkish novels with works from Chekhov, Dostoevsky, the French existentialists, and other canonical works of European literature. This prevalence in the curriculum means that the foreign authors who have inspired the New Turkish cinema filmmakers are likely to resonate with an educated Turkish audience, in addition to being recognized outside Turkey as sources for their screen adaptations. But as we'll see in a little bit, this resonance hits these audiences a little bit differently in each case. Nuri Bilge Ceylan is probably the best known of these three, especially outside Turkey, and his recurring use of Chekhov is well known. He even dedicated his second feature film, Maya Sıkıntısı, Clouds of May in English, to Chekhov himself. So this is very much a documented phenomenon. But our focus for this talk is, as I said, Zeki Demirkubuz, who was the first figure of the New Turkish cinema to win global acclaim with a transnational adaptation. And this would be his 2001 film Yazgı, or Fate, which is part of a trilogy called Karanlık Üzerine Öyküler, or Tales on Darkness. Yazgı, or Fate, is loosely based on Albert Camus' The Stranger, and it was screened as part of the Un Certain Regard section of the 55th Cannes Festival. Even before Yazgı, Demirkubuz had presented films across Europe, including high-profile festivals in Locarno, Rotterdam, and Venice. And later in his career, he has since then enjoyed a full retrospective and a spotlight on his works at TIFF in Toronto. So he's had a truly an illustrious career, and one that has really been decorated by the film festivals. Borrowing elements from global literature, particularly existentialist works, Demirkubuz often uses a mosaic of intertexts rather than a single source, and his web of allusions permeates the dialogue of his self-authored screenplays. Yet his films also undertake a strict localization of those literary elements. Casting is one such strategy for localization. Nationally famous actors figure prominently in Demirkubuz's films, including, as you could see in the picture, Engin Günaydın, who is also known for his comedy acting and lead in supporting roles. But he plays the director's version of the underground man in Yeraltı. Setting is another strategy, and this is going to become very important in our discussion of Costumbrism in a minute. Staging the action in places that are eminently Turkish, yet also far from the dappled tourist districts. This helps Demirkubuz express his authorial preoccupation with the morality of everyday life in ways that speak particularly clearly to a national audience. Among Demirkubuz's most prominent thematic concerns in his films is the proper moral action that would contrast with his anti-hero's absurdism. Demirkubuz's protagonists often shame the insincere social codes of modern Turkish society, but in doing so, they end up veering toward antisocial and even immoral behavior. The problem of social morality speaks to the socio-political commitment of art, a notion that was central for existentialist thinkers in Europe. And so there's a special relationship, of course, between French existentialism and the arts, especially literature, and authors like Camus would use this to express their philosophical beliefs. And existentialists underscore the power of art to communicate their philosophical viewpoint, particularly in the context of daily ethical considerations. And this is precisely also what Demirkubuz does as an auteurist adapter. The broad strokes of existentialism are clear in his films, as with Ceylan's adaptations, but there's no one-to-one correspondence with any literary antecedents. There's sort of a hodgepodge of sources going on, and Ceylan and Demirkubuz are alike in this. This multiplicity of influence is emphasized through certain adaptive choices. One sign of this willful obscurantism is the titles, which are normally the first marker of the intertextual relationship between cinema and other media, as Grant talks about in her article from 2002. For his English and international titles, Demirkubuz's films use single words like fate or inside that do not clearly name his key sources. Keeping these references meaningful yet oblique suggests his aim to transfigure rather than translate his foreign sources within a contemporary Turkish setting, aligning him with Catherine Grant's notion of the auteurist free adapter. Although the authors and novels that inspire him are finally acknowledged in the closing credits, declining to share a title with his source texts makes Demirkubuz's references discernible mostly, if not entirely, to an elite audience, and that's true both nationally and internationally. As one of the most politically outspoken NTC directors, Demirkubuz also uses adaptation to structure and sharpen his social critique. And we see this kind of commentary, especially in Yazgı, Fate, which I'll point out that Yazgı, being released in 2001, that's the year before the AKP came to power. One target of Demirkubuz's critique is the Turkish broadcast media. Television in particular is framed as an effective tool for social manipulation, including jurists who are shown deliberating under pressure from the press. But the biggest departure from Camus' novel, I'm very sorry for the spoilers, the biggest departure from Camus' novel lies in the criminality of their protagonists. Unlike Meursault in The Stranger, Musa in Fate is rather emphatically not guilty of murder, yet he is still convicted of the crime. The film insinuates that the justification for his imprisonment is his atheism, combined with a lack of remorse after his mother's death, and that he follows Camus, that seems suspicious to the system that aims to convict him. Fate thus gestures toward an ethical criticism of Turkish justice. The film represents modern, supposedly secular Turkey as an ultimately conservative state, where rejecting religiously inflected moral logic can throw otherwise innocent citizens into very serious legal trouble. The twist that reveals Musa's innocence lands hardest on those whose expectations of the film come from their knowledge of Camus, whose very premise pivots on Meursault's actual guilt. This shift invites the closest attention to moral statements on the moment where the film's narrative diverges most plainly from its primary source. So if we step back once again to the bigger picture, beyond these adjustments that are specific to these films, we must return to the question of why the new Turkish cinema returns again and again to the Western canon for material to adapt into internationally distributed, festival-bound art cinema. Adapting canonical works of Western literature underscores a belief in Turkey's cultural alignment with Europe, while these sources are institutionalized enough within Turkey to attract local as well as global audiences, though it is the global audiences who seem to be the NTC's primary target. And I'd say particularly in Europe, where we have these longstanding festivals where these films have done super well. Okay, so the costumbrism of these films, which is to say their representation of local specificity, is a major factor in appealing to both those national and the global audiences, but the stakes of this appeal are different depending on these audiences. Costumbrism refers to the Spanish theatrical tradition of costumbrismo, which is defined as the representation of spaces, mannerisms, and traditions associated with a particular social group. And in a terrific video essay, which was at a conference I attended about a year ago, Nico Medina argues that the concept of costumbrismo can be productively applied to cinema. In film, costumbrism shapes production design, performances, music, and indeed any aspect of representation that aims to reflect as accurately as possible the lives of people living in a specifically classed and cultured environment. It's closely related to cinematic realism, which emphasizes, following Bazin, how film can capture space and time to replicate lived experience as closely as possible. But costumbrism's roots in theater limit its purview to mise-en-scène and narrative elements. Realism has been a cornerstone of both production and reception of world cinema, including for the new Turkish cinema. And for more on this, you can see Lucia Naguib's 2020 book on world cinema, which specifically talks about the role of realism. But in the context of adaptation studies, costumbrism offers an advantage of applicability across multiple forms of expression. Unlike realism, which particularly in film theory has been discursively embedded in cinematographic analysis, with attention to long takes, long shots, and other techniques that are specific to visual recording. Costumbrism, on the other hand, is less concerned with technical conventions and more attuned to the substance of culture as conveyed through setting, characterization, and performance. So Medina emphasizes costumbrism's different effects on different audiences, and in this, the new Turkish cinema is no exception. Its costumbrism represents Turkey with a self-aware Orientalism that hits audiences differently inside or outside Anatolia. For Westerners who do not possess any deep knowledge of the locales and peoples represented on screen, costumbrist design and performance offer exoticist pleasures, while also activating a documentary perspective embedded within the fiction that informs them about these actual places and customs via the film's fictional story. I'm going to just, a really quick aside here, costumbrism does not have to be picturesque, which is certainly the case for Fate, where there are a lot of very different settings that show, the interior of people's apartments, the office where Musa is working. All of these are very specific to their locale without being the least bit picturesque, but that's still something that we're classifying as costumbrism in these cases. And for Turkish audiences, these painstakingly localized representations are a vector for identification, and that would amplify the resonance of what might be construed as a foreign story, even if it is a familiar story. So that's sort of the tightrope that would be laid out for national audiences for these films. The political work of the transnational costumbrist adaptation is to leverage feelings of authenticity when we're recognizing a quote unquote faithful adaptation. Here's that bogeyman word again. But it doesn't matter how or against what this fidelity is measured. It can be textual, it can be experiential. This gets to the identification practices that are invoked with costumbrism. These impressions of authentic representation then emphasize the compatibility of cultures that are joined together both in and through the creative encounter of this adaptation. Curiously, the new Turkish cinema's costumbrist films, while they are set in Anatolia and feature local actors, their films have never framed domestic texts, nor indeed have the literatures of their southern and eastern neighbors been deemed as worthy of adaptation for the new Turkish cinema's international audiences. And while Turkish auteurs freely and habitually adapt the work of European authors, the reverse has yet to occur, which is a lacuna also shared by filmmakers of the Turkish diaspora who are based in Europe. And these would include Fatih Akın and Ferzan Özpetek. So despite, or perhaps precisely because of their international following, filmmakers of and inspired by the new Turkish cinema have not seriously tapped into their country's own formidable literary history. And this is a history that has recently culminated in a growing list of international accolades for contemporary Turkish authors. Perhaps most famously the Nobel Prize that was awarded to Orhan Pamuk in 2006, as well as numerous international prizes and nominations for novelist Elif Shafak, just to name perhaps the two most prominent of these. And so my final point here, though, is if we consider the entirety of screen production since the turn of the millennium, there is certainly no shortage of Turkish adaptations of local sources. The issue is that such adaptations have been made for television rather than cinema. Unlike the westward inclination that shapes both production and reception of prestige filmmaking, Turkish television relies on local media industries with national backing to reach both domestic audiences and foreign markets. But these unlike the cinema, which targets Europe, these particularly target eastward neighbors and, interestingly, Latin America as well. I want to really point out, just do a shout out really quickly to Bilge Yeşil, who's a professor at CUNY. She has a forthcoming book about Turkish television and its international audiences that promises to be absolutely fantastic. She gave a presentation for my class last semester. More to come on this and some really, really interesting findings that she has. But notably with these shows, despite aiming to portray Turkish life and Turkish history, Anatolian history more broadly, despite these attempts to portray this in an appealing light, these series eschew Costumbrism and instead embrace less quote-unquote authentic and more genre-driven structures, such as escapist melodrama, which we see in Aşk-ı Memnu, known as Forbidden Love in English, or Ottoman-era costume epics like I never say this right, Diriliş Ertuğrul. Don't know the English for that one, actually. And Muhteşem Yüzyıl, which is Magnificent Century, which is sort of like, it was, I think, pitched at the time as the Turkish version of the Tudors. You can correct me in the chat. And that's basically what it was, that sort of sensationalized Ottoman history. But that was a very popular series in both nationally and internationally. It ran from 2011 to 2014, which I don't have a poster for that one, but maybe some of you already know it. Anyway, genres like escapist melodrama or costume epics forgo audiences' identification with Costumbrist representation in favor of identificatory fantasies that draw instead on audiences' familiarity with and pleasure in genre conventions. Such conventions are not to be dismissed out of hand. As Richard Dyer asserts in Entertainment and Utopia, the classic essay, entertainment is about making forms rather than texts. And the forms that resonate with audiences in Cannes or Berlin may not overlap with those that captivate television viewers in Istanbul or Islamabad. And indeed, this difference is very much supported by what Bilge Yeşil has found in her interviews. There's a whole lot of identification going on. She showed us a picture of a statue of Ertuğrul, as in the Ertuğrul from the show, I believe in Islamabad, somewhere in Pakistan, in a public park. So there's a whole lot of identification going on outside Turkey. And some real fandoms being built for these television series. And just the fandoms do not overlap with the films and the TV series. So anyway, the takeaway that I want to offer from this particular case study is that the formal and industrial contexts that distinguish Turkish literary adaptation in cinema from adaptation for television include in these contexts very differently imagined transnational collectives. I didn't even mention that Aşk-ı Memnu was based on a book, like the work of Turkish literature from, I think, the late 19th century, if I'm not mistaken. Again, you can correct me in the comments if you have a date for me. Anyway, the separation between the film-focused collective and the television-focused collective ends up reinforcing many of the same alliances and divides that have defined Turkey as a geopolitical power. And with that, we move on to the second case study. I hope I have some time. Anyway, we will talk about how to avoid this potentially and to put on the medium itself what has been carried in so many examples by nation. So I want to talk about borrowed nostalgia and the cinephile nation with Hugo and the artist. And so I want to turn to this sort of transnational rivalry that's at the center of film history and consider how a narrative focus on film as history, as object of history, as object in itself, can be leveraged under the right circumstances to replace national or transnational collectives with a collective that is focused on the medium. The artist and Hugo offer a template for framing group identity in relation not to a particular nation, but rather to the practice of filmmaking and self-identification as a cinephile. Released the same year from the start, The Artist and Hugo have been treated routinely as companion films. Both are set during the late 1920s and early 1930s, and both situate nostalgia for a particular kind of cinema at the center of the narrative, which The Artist further underscores through its faux silent formal structure, while Hugo, conversely, emphasizes this through its use of state-of-the-art 3D technology. I hope we all remember what that looked like on the big screen with the 3D. Both of these films also call attention to the Franco-American relationship that stretches back to the earliest days of cinema. I would propose frenemies as an apt description of this relationship. But anyways, the way that that plays out in these two films I find absolutely fascinating. The Artist is a French production in terms of its director, its headlining stars, the money that funded it, French. Not quite through and through, but dominant enough that it's very safe to call The Artist a French production. But it was set and actually filmed in Hollywood. It was directed by Michel Hazanavicius, who at the time was well known in France, but likely not a whole lot of other places, for his popular series of OSS comedy films, which is basically a spoof of James Bond. Like The Artist, that Bond spoof series also features the French TV and film comedian Jean Dujardin, who went on to win Best Actor at the Oscars for his role in The Artist. Meanwhile, Hugo's director, Scorsese, needs no further introduction, known the world over for his films and as something of a cinephile in chief, particularly as a preserver and defender of earlier cinema. This particular film was adapted from the richly illustrated children's novel, The Invention of Hugo Cabret, which was written by one Brian Selznick of the Hollywood Selznicks, it's worth pointing out. The narrative action in book and film takes place in Paris, which is also where part of it was filmed. I think the rest of it was filmed in the UK. A crucial and not really secondary subplot of the book and the film involves French cinema pioneer Georges Méliès, and it frames his life's work as a mystery that the young protagonist is compelled to solve. Both of these films are example of what I have elsewhere in my first book called integral exoticism, which means a narrative text whose geographic and cultural setting bears no connection to the background of its creators. Such a production may involve costumbrism, but does not require it. And I'm not going to argue that it does in these cases. Now, the practice of integral exoticism is common enough that it might seem to be entirely unremarkable. We might come up with dozens of examples just right off the top of our heads. Hollywood, especially classic Hollywood, is full of these. The Shop Around the Corner, for example, set in Budapest. Sure. It's a studio somewhere in Hollywood. Jimmy Stewart is in it. And Jimmy Stewart was born in my hometown. That's not Budapest. Anyway, when such appropriations are enacted laterally across global power structures, that is to say, when integral exoticism does not reproduce colonial and or post-colonial dynamics of exploitation and extraction, then integral exoticism can suggest a rejection of nationally delimited cultural identity and reframe cultural inclusion along different lines. And I want to argue here that this is indeed the case for both The Artist and Hugo, both of which elide national distinctions in order to situate cinema itself as the locus of nostalgia and, by extension, a collective audience that is linked by this nostalgia. While its narrative action takes place entirely in Paris, Hugo takes pains to emphasize Hollywood films in its diegesis and in its marketing, as the poster you can see makes very clear with its visual reference to the Harold Lloyd film Safety Last. As this reference suggests, despite its Parisian setting, Hugo presents a view of cinema history that privileges Hollywood at the expense of French texts. While there are, of course, many references to early films from Méliès and also the Lumière brothers, the figures who appear in the film through films, that is sort of remediated examples of silent films, these are overwhelmingly the products of Hollywood. You see Buster Keaton, Charlie Chaplin, Harold Lloyd, where contemporary French stars like Max Lander and classic serials like those of director Louis Feuillade, these are not featured on screen, but alluded to only through posters that are hung around the diegetic cinema set. Ironically, though Hugo is structured as a fictionalized biopic of one of France's most important filmmakers, it refuses to commit to a Franco-centric representation of early cinema. Which I'm not to say that that's inaccurate. I think that, but I think it really lays a little too heavy on the Hollywood at the expense of a lot of what would have been local production at the time. Where Hugo elides its setting and its representation of the filmic landscape of the early 1900s, the artist doubles down on its Hollywood focus. Filming the artist in California, French writer-director Hazanavicius represents the late 1920s studio system in a manner that completely divests from French cinema. I mean, to an almost shocking degree. This is what I find fascinating about the artist, and why I'm probably the only person who still remembers it and wants to talk about it. Even scholarly criticism of the artist tends to label the film as a Hollywood production, so insistent is the setting. And unlike the blended Franco-American heritage suggested in Hugo, French cinema history is never acknowledged within the diegesis of the artist. Instead, it sets the transition to sound, which historically, to be very clear, was at least as fraught in France as it was in the US. It's not like it went over easier in France than it did in Hollywood. It sets the film against the backdrop of Hollywood's rigid studio system, communicating its Hollywoodness as a locus for this nostalgic imaginary. Although this French erasure is surprisingly thorough and absolutely deserves further unpacking, and that would be, again, in a separate paper, both of these films, both Hugo and the artist, use this tumultuous moment to foreground the history of the cinematic medium over the cultural provenance of a given film, or of even just film tout court. So while each film combines French and American efforts at the level of production, none of the characters are poised between two national cultures or geographies. Rather, the protagonist of the artist and Méliès and Hugo navigate their roles vis-a-vis the changing industrial demands and technological advancements of the medium. The in-group is therefore defined by a connection to cinema rather than nation, and they wrestle with their self-perception and in-group status through their filmmaking. Can Georges Valentin still be a star post-Cinq-Sound? Will the fictionalized Georges Méliès publicly reclaim his status as a pioneering filmmaker after years outside the industry and the loss of most of his films? These are the questions that the films pose and seek to answer. These films also ask the audiences to reclaim their connection to cinema. Are we cinephile enough to enjoy a brand new silent film, I use that term advisedly, that recycles elements of famous films to celebrate the industry's resilience? Are we cinephile enough to acknowledge that it might actually be kind of awesome to imagine what Méliès's films might look like on the big screen in 3D? I found that pretty awesome. I know that that's a point of contention. I thought it was great. The cinephile collective thus emerges as the key in-group in these films, framing questions of identity around affiliation to a certain idea of film culture by allowing allegiance to the medium to supersede allegiance to nation. And this despite a very strong history in France of conceptualizing national cinema precisely as such. I'll add here, and this is something we can maybe talk about afterwards if we have time, Hazanavicius's next film was an adaptation of a memoir written by Jean-Luc Godard's wife, now ex-wife, Anne Wiazemski, and he brought that to the screen. So he goes from like totally effacing France to doing essentially like a biopic of Jean-Luc Godard, which is a wild duo of films that I would absolutely love to talk about if anybody else is interested in this as I am. Anyway, just to move on very quickly to my conclusion, while we'll wrap this up and open the conversation to some other voices. With this alternative framework firmly in mind, I want to segue into this conclusion, and with my apologies to Eckart and Maria, who have assembled an unparalleled program of speakers on the theme of adaptation without borders, I would like very humbly to suggest that we not seek to disregard or try to erase borders, but rather that we understand that adaptation can be a uniquely productive means of redrawing them. It is not the borders themselves that we must tear down, ignore, or shun. Indeed, I am arguing precisely that boundaries are a social inevitability. And an even more important question than, so where do we draw these boundaries, is the question of how rigid we perceive them to be. The idea of adaptation pushing or stretching boundaries has also already been suggested in the series, though not precisely in these terms. Recalling the ecstasy of adaptation that Tom talked about so brilliantly last week, we might consider now how we respond to this feeling of being outside ourselves. This removal to elsewhere that characterizes ecstasy is a self-generated internal response. And importantly, its effects are quite fleeting. This means that this kind of removal is not comparable to deportation or to exile, both of which stem from the idea of the nation state and indicate an externally imposed and more or less permanent and necessarily violent removal. After experiencing a state of ecstasy, we emerge still very much ourselves. We return to ourselves, only changed. And it is both individually and culturally dangerous to deny this capacity for change after this return to self, to instead cling desperately to old and arbitrarily rigid boundaries, shoring them up out of fear of what may happen if they were to collapse around us. But borders and boundaries never crumble, nor do they evaporate into the ether. They can only be redrawn. Ecstatic experiences might thus inspire us to redraw our personal borders in ways that surprise even ourselves. In fact, I would argue that the surest evidence that we have experienced ecstasy at all is whether, after the fact, we feel a tangibly greater openness to the world around us. If we feel that those boundaries have been irreversibly redrawn somehow as a result of this experience. A productive response to ecstatic feeling is to consciously accommodate this perceived difference so that what was once clearly outside ourselves can be openly recognized as actually somehow a part of ourselves. Yet it is important also to acknowledge that ecstasy is inscribed at the individual level, and in this talk, my pressing questions involve the collective. And this is where we turn once again to national frameworks. National screens of all kinds have a privileged ability to reach audiences who belong to a collective whose cultural touch points can be presumed to overlap in predictable ways. This includes exposure to a similar set of texts, especially in places where a standardized curriculum shapes compulsory national education. And this by itself is also not universal. This is not the case in the United States, for example, where curricula are very emphatically not determined at the national level. That's a huge part of American culture, and it has caused as many problems as it has solved, I'm sure. And so it doesn't work in all cases, but there are cases like Turkey where there's a very clear national curriculum that is followed with some variability, but there's a certain reliability to it as well. Although adaptation studies has long recognized that enjoying adapted texts does not hinge on knowledge of their sources, adapting a text offers the ability to leverage this potential knowledge to inspire individuals, firstly, to recognize their involvement in a collective membership and possibly to interpolate themselves about the terms of this membership. If individual responses, perhaps even ecstatic responses, can shift consensus within that collective, these shifts can inspire meaningful political change. Adaptation can therefore connect an individual to collectives of all kinds in ways that other texts might not. So in lieu of a conclusion, and I did promise chaos, just to clarify this, I want to turn back very briefly to the galaxy-brained attempt to find alternatives to national and transnational frameworks that can use adaptation to foster a more inclusive sense of community and collective identification. One avenue for community building comes through media platforms. Mubi, Netflix, Apple Plus, Hulu, just to name the subscription video streamers. And even these, I would point out common national flavors. I'll point out that our Mubi in Turkey, at least at the moment, has a Zeki Demirkubuz retrospective. Maybe yours does too. You can check it out if you're on Mubi. If you're part of that collective, you can go check out Fate Tonight if you like. It is, of course, not just about paid subscribers or subscriptions. Having an account can be enough. TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and other free-to-use social media networks all have the capacity to instill a sense of community as well. And they can do this through etiquette and best practices, not snitch tagging on Twitter. One of the first things you learn when you join the platform, usually the hard way, I think. Trending topics, public, private channels of communication, and again, rules of etiquette and how to use these. So this can also foster a sense of community that can then, of course, be violated, which is part of the issue with social media. For the paid services, it's also not just about video. Right now, at least in the States, there's a very clear in or out call in the ongoing conflict between Spotify and Neil Young, who just, I think last week, pulled his music from their catalog in protest of podcaster Joe Rogan's continued affiliation with the platform. I will note, though, that on Spotify, you can still find some of his songs on the Eat, Pray, Love soundtrack, which has not been scrubbed, interestingly. I'm totally dismayed to report lack of access to his score for Dead Man, which is my favorite Jarmusch, for those of you keeping track. These platforms have also ushered in another big change in media, and namely, this is the collapse of distinctions that had separated the consumption habits of film from those of television. The pandemic that we're still living through has only exacerbated this problem, closing movie theaters temporarily or even permanently because of the risks involved in patronizing them. So the question of adaptation here is as much a technological one as a narrative one. In the age of streaming video, we are all adapting to delivery systems that can rely less or differently on nationally specific apparati of regulation, market, and habits of consumption. Production is also returning to more vertical integration, disrupting long-standing conventions that dictated release schedules and habits of consumption. I attended another talk not too long ago that was hosted by colleagues at Kadir Has University in Istanbul, who are working on a project in saying and interviewing people who produce this television in Turkey. And basically, people in the industry love working for Netflix because industrially, it's so much more appealing than working on television in Turkey. It's just the conditions of labor are so much better for a 10-episode miniseries as opposed to these Turkish historical epic series or whatever else it goes. It's a slog filming these things. It's 2.5 hours every week on television, and the seasons are barely seasons. It's basically like 40 weeks out of the year that these new episodes are being produced. So Netflix is getting its teeth into these national production context in those ways as well, which is also really interesting to see. This also underscores the fact that nation and genre are showing signs of merging into each other in some really interesting ways. Transnational fandoms can realign collective identity in really provocative ways. You see this happening with K-pop, K-drama, all the popular culture out of Korea that's been exported all over the world. You see this with Turkish dizi. Both of these, I know I cited this once in the chat a couple weeks ago, but Fatima Bhutto's book, New Kings of the World from 2019 talks quite a bit about this in, I think, very productive ways. Fandoms on the whole can also function as non-state but not entirely apolitical collectives. The rise of transmedia texts also makes questions of intertextuality really crucial to understanding how these collectives function in the world. And now here's where I acknowledge that it's very dismaying to see how even the non-state alternatives that I could come up with are dominated by the products of capitalism. I have no personal answer to this. I would love to hear any ideas that people have. But I also want to shout out a forthcoming symposium at the University of Calgary. I can put this link in the chat once I switch my screen. This symposium has proposed a reframing of internationalism as opposed to transnationalism. Internationalism that aims to investigate the problem of solidarity across time and space in order to furnish new concepts and vocabularies for the radical film theories of the future. So we have the sense of solidarity across nations that is coming to operate somehow within certain spheres of film. Whether that expands beyond film, whether that expands beyond certain kinds of film, that remains to be seen. But I think that promises to be a very provocative discussion over in Calgary. Now, just again, finally wrapping this up, we are no more bound to uphold the social borders we know today than we are to remain the people we were yesterday. We are social animals, but our understanding of collective identity and our obligations to it are constantly evolving. Change is inevitable, and adaptation also, of course, relies on change, but it is tempered by the requirement to shed new light on something that already existed. Confronting this past through adaptation can challenge as well as comfort us, and not always in equal measure. Still, the power of recognition that adaptation allows can introduce new ways of framing social collectives, both within and beyond the national. With that, I thank you very much for enduring my chaos here and elsewhere. And so now I open the chat. I don't know what I'm going to find. Thank you.